Hello and welcome to the Institute for Security Studies. I'm Otilia Anna Maunganidze. I head special projects here at the Institute. I will be taking you through a journey with three of our speakers. One of them is on their way from Johannesburg, in which we hope to make the fourth industrial revolution something you understand, something that is simple. It's something that over the past number of years has been spoken about by many people as the incoming revolution of the world. But a lot of the commentary doesn't really tell us what it is and what it means, particularly what it means for Africa. We're extremely honored today to have the ambassador of the Republic of Korea with us, not least because of the work that Korea itself has done in terms of advancing the fourth industrial revolutions and in many ways leading the path in helping not just the Korean community but the rest of the world to understand what it really means to have a fourth industrial revolution, but particularly looking at aspects around what the fourth industrial revolution means for employment. Ambassador Park is the ambassador of the Republic of Korea to South Africa and has worked extensively on the African continent, having previously been posted in Uganda, but also has worked for the Korean government, both in the foreign ministry as well as in the presidency. So he's a person who has extreme experience from the governmental side of things, but also the technical, economic aspects of the fourth industrial revolution are something that Ambassador Park will take us through. Joining him and joining myself is Marius Oosthuizen from the Gordon International Business School, attached to the University of Pretoria, who also has a wealth of experience, particularly on issues around economic development, economic advancement. And one of the questions I have already posed to Marius, and I hope he'll respond to, is what the fourth industrial revolution means for South Africans, but particularly for the people that he's teaching at the Institute. What does it mean? What are the soft skills or the critical skills that people need to be able to advance the fourth industrial revolution? We will also be joined by Martin Davies as he arrives from Deloitte, who also looks particularly at issues around emerging markets, but very specifically, Martin looks at the issues of the automotive industries. So we've got quite I say anyway, a good mix of people who will take us through what I think is not a complicated issue, but that has been complicated by the discourse. Without wasting too much of your time, Ambassador Park, what's the fourth industrial revolution?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for all coming to the seminar this morning. And first of all, I'm very privileged to be among the real experts in this business. And you may ask, what's my part? I think it is inclusiveness. So there has to be a mixed balance of everybody in this fourth industrial revolution. And preparing for this seminar, I had a challenge. I thought it was very too technical, and they also doom and gloom about this, prospect of robots, AIs taking over our jobs. But the more I read into the text and studied, I learned that it is not true. And I think the crux of this revolution is what we can call the human-centric, challenge that is posed. So in the end, I think it's all up to human capacity of finding what is the best for inclusive, development. And in our case, Korea, as many other countries, the leader in fourth industrial revolution, I think, is Germany, which started Industry 4.0 in 2011. And we hear about this terminology, fourth industrial revolution, from I think 2016 at the World Economic Forum by the chairman of World Economic Forum, Schwab. But there's a characteristic in our country, different with Germany. Germany is about smart factory, which embodies and implements the fourth industrial revolution of combining digital skill into and also apply. The current government has came up with this human-centric policy strategy to respond to the fourth industrial revolution. It is about inclusive growth. On one hand, it addresses industrialization, how we can move forward and move up the scale into the fourth industrial revolution. But equally important is another track of solving social problems like health, unemployment, environment, security, and all sorts of things that is accompanied by advanced development in capitalism and so on. And based on three areas of innovation, industrialization, based on industrial ecosystem, and also third part is meeting the challenge of future change in the society in the future. So that in sum, I think emphasizes the importance of human element, which is the worrisome prospect of jobs being cut. And I found that the technology doesn't necessarily displace the employment. Rather, in our case, it has kind of enhanced. Because from 2010, according to ITU ICT Development Index, our country was always the first for, I think, 7 years in a row. And per capita robots, that is, how many robots individual people have, nations have, we are ranked number one throughout. But actually in the process, employment has grown. So we can see that this robotics fourth industrial revolution doesn't really displace. And the study shows that it doesn't displace human occupation, but only the activities of human occupation. And there's a famous bio engineer in Korea. His name is Jung Jae-sung from KAIST, Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. He says that coincidental innovations, thinking, like what physicist Archimedes was able to come up when he was in the bathtub, cannot, happen with robots. Robots don't have the ability to conduct simultaneously your different, work. So creativity and I think basic, work skills is still very relevant. And in the end, manufacturing I think is really important because you can say it's a revolution, but it's actually the continuum of industrialization. So we should not, think lightly of the current challenges and fundamentals when thinking about the fourth industrial revolution. Okay, I think that's my take.
Thank you, and welcome, Martin. We were just talking.
You saw me sneak in?
No. We were just talking about how you are going to make the fourth industrial revolution the easiest thing for us to understand, and that you've got the answers. But before I get to you, so that Marius gives you a little bit of a cheat sheet, right? You've heard what the ambassador said about the way in which for South Korea, the efforts in ensuring, one, that the fourth industrial revolution is part of the societal change, but also that it is a process of inclusive development and it is human-centered. For South Africa, or the African continent as a whole, this idea of it being human-centered cannot be understated. South Africa, for example, sits at an unemployment of 27.6. And when you look at the youth unemployment, that's much higher. So how, and I'll start with that, and then you can also share a little bit more in terms of general commentary, I would say, on the fourth industrial revolution. How can the fourth industrial revolution be the thing that turns the tide? What kind of jobs does the fourth industrial revolution bring?
So thank you, Atalia, for that introduction and for the opportunity to be here, Ambassador, for making it possible, and of course to the ISS for hosting us. I think for me the starting point is for us to ask ourselves, what is the fourth industrial revolution and what is it not? We refer to it, of course, as the fourth industrial revolution because there's been three major industrial revolutions that have preceded it. The first, of course, around the late 1800s, early 1800s, was the revolution in energy that came through steam energy, coal energy, electricity, then mechanization that came on the back of that, and then, of course, computers, which is what most of us would have grown up with, the ability to connect and share information. Now, what's interesting about Africa, and important to note, is that Africa lags behind not only in the fourth industrial revolution, but in the first, second, and third industrial revolution. You know, we look at a country like South Korea or Germany and we get excited about the technology, and we should get excited because the technology allows us to do things that we could never do in human history. We can now get a banking app to a rural person through a smartphone. We can get medical data from a community to a hospital, to a practitioner. But in the context of Africa, we don't often have electricity or infrastructure or the industry to support that technology. And so if we're going to have a meaningful conversation about Industry 4.0 in Africa, we really have to have a conversation that stretches across Industry 1, 2, 3, and 4, and ask ourselves, how do we unlock the productivity, how do we unlock the growth that Africa would need to transform? Now that then becomes a very exciting conversation to have. I noticed the meeting today was described as endless possibilities. If you think about a continent like Africa, where up to 75% of Africans don't have access to electricity. Up to 80% don't have access to clean running water on a daily basis. Now, under the first, second, and third industrial revolution, to provide those services, you needed a centralized economy with a strong government that drives large-scale projects at a very high cost to deliver water or electricity. In Industry 4.0, if you start talking about renewable energy, smart grids, what you are able to do is to create decentralized, locally governed energy, water, and what we would call in the sustainability world, the circular economy. Now, when you start thinking in that way around energy, you start thinking in that way around education and other forms of services like health, the potential for Africa is immense. Let me come to the heart of your question around inclusiveness. There are reasons why the first, second, and third industrial revolution has lagged behind in Africa. We often talk in the development world around things like governance, policy stability, financial and fiscal stability. These framework conditions are not going to disappear just because we have good technology. And so in the context of South Africa and Africa, if we're going to see the fourth industrial revolution bring development, and if we're going to see that development be inclusive, we also have to work on the more old style things like good governance, creating the rule of law, the institutional mechanisms and the framework within which Industry 4.0 can work. If we do that, what begins to happen is we get into a very exciting situation where Africa has tremendous natural resources, huge untapped potential in the labor market, and the technology enables us to very quickly access that resource, to very quickly access that human capital potential, if we use the technology to develop it, and to unlock growth and development for Africa, probably in ways that the rest of the world has never seen. And we see examples of that in M-Pesa and other innovative applications of the technology in the context of Africa.
You've spoken a lot around the various industrial revolutions, right? And it was interesting for me listening to the ambassador, because he almost made a conscious effort to speak of whether it's Korea 4.0 or Germany 4.0 to take away, still maintaining it, but take away the just reference to the industrial component. And I think that's where the issues around innovation, around change, around inclusivity come in as well, because like you say, for Africa, we are going to have to go through these revolutions pretty much at the same time. But speaking specifically on innovation, I'm going to push you a little bit on this. Speaking specifically on innovation, I'm reminded of Esther Bozarab, who, demographics professor at the time, but a Danish and French woman who sort of essentially made popular this idea that necessity is the mother of invention, right? That you find innovation in spaces that you might not have thought it would be there. So delivery of medicines through drone technology into remote areas in Rwanda. The idea that in Kenya, in Somalia, in Zimbabwe, people transact through their mobile phones because the infrastructure, the banking infrastructure, is not as widespread and as supportive of the community as possible. That mobile internet penetration in those communities is moving at a faster pace than in other parts of the world. In many ways, reimagining, if I can put it that, the financial sector, ways of communicating, ways of getting things. That's happening on the African continent. So yes, we've got, these gaps in terms of our need to push forward. But if you can, and before I turn to Martin, but if you can maybe touch a little bit on that space for innovation, the fact that we are in many ways forced to go through 4 revolutions at the same time that the rest of the world could do in phases. We have to do it at the same time. Can we do it? Can we have first, second, third, fourth revolutions all at once?
I think it is the right starting point, that at the heart of this industrial revolution is this idea of innovation, creativity. I think the way that we think about that is what lies at the heart of real innovation is really the ability to unlock new forms of value that were previously unavailable. Now, that's not limited to the tech sector or the banking sector. You can unlock new value in education, in health, in infrastructure, in every subsystem of the society. And using technology, you can do that very quickly, you can do that very efficiently. I think what we have to appreciate alongside that is that innovation and creativity on its own is not a panacea, because we also have to think about the adoption of that technology, the adoption of that innovation. If you take a particular community where there isn't a strong local government, there isn't a strong rule of law, there isn't a sense of security, what happens to the technology once you put it into that community is a contest erupts around who owns it, who gets to control it, and you might see the very innovative idea fall flat or have a short-lived lifespan. And so what we would have to do in Africa, and this is where governments in particular and large corporate institutions have a role to play, is we have to think short-term in a very iterative, innovative, dynamic way, but we also have to think long-term in developing the institutions, and as I mentioned earlier, the framework conditions, so that the innovation and the development we do in the short term doesn't just serve to destabilize the entire system. And I'll finish with that. In many parts of the world where technology in Industry 4.0, like the internet, social media, mobile technology, where those have penetrated the society, in the absence of some of the foundational systems, what it's done is it's destabilized the political system. We saw that in the Arab Spring. We saw some of that recently in Sudan. And not all of that is bad. Some of that is good because it's young, dynamic citizens asserting their democratic rights. But we have to create those broader conditions so that the innovation doesn't become destabilizing, but in fact drives us up the development path towards a more fair and equitable society.
Martin, welcome again.
Apologies, everyone. I have no excuse. Poor show by me.
New forms of value. The work that you do with Deloitte, you're looking at emerging markets, you're looking at the African market, right? And hopefully ensuring that those emerging markets, that the African continent finds itself soon, I hope anyway, at the same level as where South Korea is or where Germany is. Based on what you've heard from what Marius has said, Fourth Industrial Revolution in Africa, what does it mean practically? What does it mean for us?
Can I be skeptical?
Yes, you can.
Just to everything what Mario said, I agree with, but I think it's very difficult to innovate your way out of a failed state. Secondly is, I think this concept of 4IR, maybe don't quote this, is faddish, if that makes sense. 5 years ago, who would have mentioned 4IR? All of a sudden, everyone's obsessed with it. I guarantee you now, in 2-3 years' time, this will be called chips. I think, as Africans, the most important revolution, we're all obsessed with 4IR, the most important industrial revolution has been dramatically impacting our lives and development trajectories for the last generation, and we've still yet to understand it. It's called the industrialization of China. and the incredibly disruptive impact that has had on supply, production, and value chains globally. If we think back 25 years, a quarter century, it's called a generation. So Africa, the most diversified economy in Africa. Our manufacturing to GDP is what, about 23-24%. We're now down to arguably 13-odd% of World Bank figures. We've hemorrhaged our employment generative manufacturing capacity on the continent. Was that because of 4IR? We suddenly thought about it? Was it because labor policy? Potentially. Or was it because of this disruptive thing called the China price? I think it's the latter. And we haven't quite got to grips to that yet. We're talking about competing for IR future of jobs. But the real competition is what's coming out of Asia. The third point is that what we see now is not a trade war. There's no trade war between the US and China. It's a far, far deeper, inevitable geo-economic conflict taking place. The trade sort of frictions, and the case of Huawei, ZTE, amongst others, is merely symptomatic of the underlying cause. However, what Donald Trump unknowingly has done has created significant opportunity for Africa, but we haven't seen it yet. And we should actually be thanking Donald Trump if only we take advantage of it. It's disruption of supply chain, value chain out of China into other frontier emerging market manufacturing heavy economies, predominantly Southeast Asia. Now, if Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, etc., Vietnam in particular, can pick up and absorb this departing manufacturing heavy investment processing out of China, which is trying to avoid tariffs into the world's largest economy, the US, why isn't it coming to us? Whose fault is that? I think it's fairly obvious. That's an incredible opportunity. You know, it reminds me of a friend of mine. He was an economic. I often cite this. I often quote him. He was an economist in India, in Delhi, an advisor to the former government in India. You know, you guys in South Africa. When you say Africa, I'll just paraphrase slightly. You're a bit like us in India. You have a similar strategy. So I said to him, what do you mean? He says, you never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And that reminds me, you know who you are. That reminds me of us right now, because these big sort of geoeconomic forces are taking place globally, and we're so consumed of our own internal stuff, often challenges, real or perceived, we don't see the bigger picture. True. The last point I want to make, and this is intentionally provocative, I think, all of it, is it comes back to what I alluded to about, is there such a thing as a 4IR? Arguably, I would call it, there's undoubtedly commerce has accelerated due to technology. You know, think about how busy your day jobs are now. Older people in the room, you guys used to communicate via fax. What's that about? You know, what did you do all day? Now I get 250 emails a day in my inbox, and I got to clear it out. The acceleration of commerce has taken place because of technology. Technology is resulting in the coming together, if you will, or diffusion of business models, where you have retailers, financiers, telcos, their business models are all overlapping, and they're all competitors. Everyone these days is either a potential collaborator or competitor, despite even 5 years ago, they were very distinct sectors. That's sort of my observation. That's something we're helping clients with, trying to figure this out. Everyone's trying to get into this retail space. But my last comment is as follows, is that this 4IR thing, I've got a whole lot of newspaper articles I found on the web, headlines from New York Times, Washington Post, a few others out of the UK, and I looked at the dates, and it talked about robots taking your job. And I saw headlines from the 1980s, robots are taking your job, New York Times front page. I saw exactly the same in the 60s. I even saw it in the 20s, 1920s, 100 years ago. Robots are taking your job. It's called Henry Ford. The first article I ever found was 1812. And it was an article published in a newspaper published in the UK out of northeast England, a place called Leeds City. And it was entitled Sabotage. And the word sabotage allegedly comes from a French word. They had these wooden shoes called sabots. And the workers were throwing their wooden shoes into these new machines, which were taking their jobs to damage the destroyed machines, the processing. Hence, sabot, the shoes, became sabotage. And this goes back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So, is it new? Are your jobs being taken? Maybe they've been displaced somewhere else. Jobs are not destroyed, they're just displaced. The challenge is for us in our part of the world, how do we capture the displacement? But let's see the bigger picture to do so.
Yeah. So job displacement, I quite like that phrasing. When you were talking, I was a little bit worried that maybe I'll be out of a job. But then I thought, you know what? Siri needs to be reprogrammed, and I can assist with that. Both Marius and Martin have spoken, perhaps unintentionally, maybe on purpose, about the critical role that the state, that a functioning, governing state plays in any revolution, right? From your experience, Ambassador Park, how has the government, working sometimes together with the corporate sector, been able to advance what you refer to as iKorea 4.0?
Okay, I think it's all about teamwork, and more than any other time. We are in an era where the strong teamwork is necessary among government, companies, institutes, and every individuals. Because when you're talking about inclusive innovation, growth, everybody has to come on board. And it's not just a matter of whether government plays a positive role or negative role, or how big role it plays. It's about being facilitator of business, of growth. And as you know, laissez-faire state of economy is a myth in actuality. When you see the history, the talk of laissez-faire liberalism came from Western world when the government was already established and they had developed a state system. But in many countries in Africa where you see nation building has actually not been completed and the government role is very weak, how can you discard the role of government? So you have to see in the context. So what I'm advocating is that not necessarily government intervention in every matters, because in the end, market mechanism with all its limitation is the best mechanism to make economic work. There has not been any alternative so far, but there's a definitely important role for the government to act as a facilitator, and you can see in the case of Korea and Singapore, Asian countries, and also Nordic countries. See, Denmark, Norway, all of them have played a very positive role. So I think it should be brought back. And in the case of Africa, where people suffer and things break down and not advance, not because of too much government, because of lack of proper services that is so basic to the fundamentals of economy. That's the issue. So it all comes back, I think, to the mindset change. Marius, you talked about technologies, everything, but if you don't have the workings that make them work, like how to run institutions, how to governance, it's all the doings of people, the leaders. So I think it's more about the lifestyles of the people and leaders that matters most than actually technology institutions, because they're only the means to an end.
Mm-hmm. So that recognition that there's the need to have the right kind of leadership to actually push forward what Marius refers to as going through the 4 revolutions at the same time, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the recently adopted protocols from the African Union side, and one that took the least amount of time. Part of my job, I still have one, is tracking the adoption and the implementation of continental legal treaties. It's drone work, right? But I love it. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement was the quickest instrument for member states to sign, ratify, and now going into adoption at the next AU summit. What does that say? We've had a range of instruments, some of which date as far back as 2006, that still haven't gotten the number of ratifications they need to enter into force. And here we've got an African Continental Free Trade Agreement agreed on at the AU summit early last year, and then in less than a year, we've got the number of countries that need to ratify it. So this is just the signing and the agreeing to a continental free trade movement, right? It's not yet the implementation phase. But does that in any way at least show a recognition on the part of African leaders that in order for them to get anywhere, in order for them to be part of what Martin is talking about, why is it we haven't capitalized on the potential for trade with other countries, with other smaller countries in Southeast Asia, but also elsewhere, when we recognize the need for free trade on the African continent? I'm going to throw it to you, Marius.
So I think the notion of an Africa free trade area is a wonderful one, and I think long term, if we look at Africa, it's an obvious opportunity for African countries to make the best of the region. But I think we have to pause and reflect for a second on the reality on the ground. Yeah. Signing an agreement at that level among the political elite is one thing. If you take any two cities in Africa that are 2,000 or 3,000 miles or kilometers apart, and you ask your GPS on your cell phone to tell you how long it will take to drive between the cities, it often says 3, 4, 5, or 6 days. And the reason for that is because on the ground, basic things like constructing a tar road, maintaining that road, and maintaining the environment around that conducive to trade is lacking. And so while we should be optimistic about those mega macro agreements, I think on the ground, the agreements within our society around good governance and implementation and execution of policy are actually the work that Africa should be doing more hastily to get us to that big picture. Maybe let me say one more positive thing about the free trade agreement. In Industry 4.0, where we have to be connected to the global environment to trade not just in physical products, but in virtual digital services, connectivity becomes important, and that is not something that an African country can do on its own. We have to think on a regional, continental level about internet connectivity, about broadband, about access, LTE, and all these other forms of connectivity, and that provides a mechanism for that conversation to be a continental one. So on that side, I think it's a positive, but it remains to be supported by the work on the ground.
Martin, give us a negative.
Let me tell you something. I'll take you on that. The difference between the optimist and the pessimist has access to more information. Anyway, I'm a realist. A couple of things. So I was at the AU meetings in February, up in Addis, and it's massively refreshing to see African states. 3 years ago we were never there, but being proponents of free trade. I'm a free market fundamentalist. This is fantastic. The only other country currently, and has been since it started negotiating to join the WTO in 1985, was the Chinese. Always pro-free trade for obvious reasons. Excess capacity, export-supported growth model. Simple. And in the current times of Brexit and Trump, it's refreshing to hear governments talking free trade, and that's a positive. The counter to that is that what many of our small African states have been unable to do post-independence, unlike small Asian states, think ROK, Singapore, you mentioned, economies like Hong Kong, Taiwan, have been able to create for themselves a competitive, or firstly comparative, and secondly competitive economic advantage. And we always talk in Africa in very lazy terms that we have resources. These economies and countries I mentioned, the only resource that counts is intellectual capital. Everything else is actually irrelevant, from Japan down to Singapore. Simple as that. So if we're relying on our resources, I'm afraid that's so 18th century. So will free trade change the situation? We all agree, and Paul Kagame will agree with me, hence them pushing this of free trade, ACFTA, is that you need to create economies of market scale. Because in Africa, traditionally, capital has chased resources, extractive industries. In the Africa Rising narrative, capital has chased demographics. That's why Nigeria is so attractive. And unfortunately, the whole tech story, and Peso was mentioned and so many others, no one gets rich through spending. You get rich through saving and investing. And unfortunately, the whole tech narrative is around, we can get Africans to buy stuff. It's too superficial. Africa Rising should not be an FMCG play. And I think the whole Africa Rising narrative has been, using a South African word, captured by the FMCG narrative. Selling sugar water, a bottle of sugar water a day to an African is not development in my terms. It comes back to what Marius was saying about building an entire ecosystem in a neighboring state. So the last thing is that Asian economies and states did not develop or succeed on the back of liberal free trade in the region. They certainly, just the opposite, did not develop because of a continental regional initiative collaboration at all. There was no sort of collaboration between a Tokyo, a Beijing, a Taipei, a Hong Kong, etc., to sort of look towards a regional plan at all. It was the opposite. It was an unleashing of incredible competitive forces in Asian economies, not just at a state level, but at provincial levels as well, especially if you're Chinese. And that competition and intense economic pursuit for survival of a state underpinned the intangible of development and growth in Asia. If we're waiting for the AU, with all due respect, to write policies that are going to enable our success, it's nice, but it doesn't really drive the fundamentals of what's needed to a state-enabled, highly economically literate, and the two words that are key in my life, competitive and productive economies. That's what it really boils down to.
As we're wrapping up this part of the discussion, Martin just said now you get rich through saving and investing, right? Ambassador Park, I'm going to turn to you. The conversation around the role that foreign direct investment plays on the African continent is one that we're constantly having, right? So if you can share with us just a little bit in terms of what role foreign direct investment plays, but also I think the nature of that investment as well is something that we would be interested in.
Yeah, that's a very important question, and Korea provides very interesting case of the role of FDI. So at first, at the initial period of development, we could not get foreign direct investment in the first place because Korea was considered too risky to invest. How can you invest in a country where still at war with North Korea and the danger is looming? And not even aid agencies were willing to provide assistance, you see. Even a head of USAID in the late 50s reported to Washington that South Korea is a hopeless country and it cannot recover in 50, 100 years. So maybe that was a blessing because we did not rely on foreign resources per se, but we had to build and what we can have. First of all, through grants, military aids coming from the United States. But we are forced to save what little we have. So our industry started with light industry, but it was a heavy saving because we did not have the capital. And other means we use is sending off our nurses and miners to Germany and get some pay from their salaries. And through some reparations from Japan and our involvement in Vietnamese war, you see. But slowly, success brought in those capitals because international community saw what's happening in Korea, and they were able to invest more and willing. So slowly our foreign capital came incrementally, and FDI came much later. After we fully industrialized and completed our heavy and petrochemical industries. And now, much later, after we faced the Asian financial crisis, and we are more open economy, there's definitely a need for foreign capitals because we are open economy. And the government has been trying to attract more FDI, but still it's not very much. But still, I think we're in the level of $3-4 billion, but not very much. But it all depends on the strategy of what kind of resources is best fitted to your situation, and what's best for your long-term your growth.
Thank you. I'm going to throw the same question to you. I'm going to start with Martin, right? We've done a number of investment drives, but not just South Africa. I think a number of African countries have recognized this need for investment, this need to get rich, perhaps get rich quickly, but to get rich, right? Your thoughts?
Again, intentionally provocative. FDI doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I'll tell you why. We lose sight of this, and because the Korean embassy is kindly supporting this, I'll default to Asia. What is the money actually doesn't matter. It's the intellectual property that comes with the money. Technology does not naturally diffuse. It doesn't flow across borders. If there's a great invention in Silicon Valley or in Bangalore or Singapore or Seoul, whatever it may be, or Israel, it doesn't just naturally arrive here by DHL. It doesn't come through a bank account. It doesn't come through the Ministry of Finance sort of coffers. It comes through people. And what you find is that a country like Korea, undoubtedly, countries like China Exhibit A, where multinational corporations have been part and parcel of the country's own development strategy. One and the same thing. So the Chinese, the Koreans before, slightly ahead, would encourage as much multinational investment in their country as possible. And by hook or by crook, get the IP that comes with the money. I've seen this. I remember doing a lot of projects in China, advisor work going into the country where literally multinationals would be willing to write a multi-billion-dollar check. And the Chinese said, no thanks, okay, we don't want it. We want your IP. And there's many South African corporates, you know who they are, who have gone in. Some didn't go in, some did. And it was not about the money. Do you know any African economy that will turn down an $8 billion check on FDI? The Chinese did. Because they said, where's the IP? You don't give IP? We don't want you, sorry. So an example is that it's about, our strategy, Department of Home Affairs, apologies, is we want your money, we just don't want you. Where in actual fact, the reality is we should want you, but keep your money. And bring that IP. And this is very emotionally uncomfortable if you're a bit of a what's the word, like a visa nationalist these days. And I think, is that, look at Dubai, Emirates. Would it be successful if no foreigners ever went there? It wouldn't exist. Same story of China, would never be where it is today. Same with Korea, same with Singapore. All the success cases are being based on, I hate to use this word, it's too loaded, but it's true, foreigners coming to your country and bringing IP with them. Last example of this is you guys, most of you, would enjoy, hopefully copious amounts sometimes, drinking South African wine. How did that technology get here? Any idea? It didn't just suddenly arrive. It came through about 350 people who landed here post the Edict of Nantes, 1683, in France, religious persecution against the French Huguenots. We ended up about 350 of them. That included sort of productive people and less productive people. Maybe some were kids. So maybe arguably 100, 150 people were actually economically active. And they brought an entire industry to South Africa. So one thing the Germans will tell you, this is pre-1871 German unification, is that German industrialization has its roots in the Huguenots, about 25, 30,000 of them moving to Prussia. They were very technical competence, technically able, they brought skills with them. About 30,000 of us Huguenots went to the UK and started off Industry 1.0. So when you start talking about development in Africa and Industry 4.0, it's not about the technology, that's great. But really, all the money, kind of irrelevant, that comes later. But you got to get the best people possible. And you get them from wherever you are in the world. I wish I could get like 1 million Koreans here. True. Imagine what would happen.
Yeah.
They'd bring so much IP with them. Will it, then people start getting a little bit emotional about it because, hey, it's us and it's them. They're taking from us. Well, in many cases across certain parts of this continent, maybe from the Eastern Congo, believe me, there ain't much to take. And some people say, oh no, they're taking our resources. Well, the real resource is not in the ground. It's what's up here.
Marius, we're going to count on what's up here for you, right? You basically get, from the panelist point of view, you get the final word on this. You've heard what Ambassador Park has had to say. You've heard what Martin has had to say about what it is that is needed, right? Do you agree?
So I think, with this kind of conversation, everyone would agree that we would love to see Africa develop and succeed and thrive and be wealthier and better off, and we would all agree on that. The question that comes out of that is, how do we get there? And I think the temptation often is to want to settle on one thing. It's going to be the technology, or it's going to be the human capital, or it's going to be the FDI. And I think the reality is that it's not one thing. It's a range of things. And you, at the beginning of the session, Talia, said, help us make this simple. I think what we need to do is take something that is in fact complex, and we have to find a simple solution, but that provides for the sophistication of the complexity that's involved. In the context of Africa, my own view is we have to think of this almost as a developmental spine. So if you think about it as a developmental spine, and you took Africa country by country, and you started with geography, and you said, where is this country geographically? What are the advantages of that, like Singapore did? You then go to resources. You say, what can we take from the resources given the geography? We then add to that infrastructure that enables us to use those resources. And then, of course, come in things like human capital development, institution building. And when you start putting the enabling conditions around that spine, the potential for that country starts to emerge from that. Now, that process in and of itself, if you had to try and simplify it as far as possible, I would borrow a word from the competitiveness literature, which is the word capability. What is the capability that this country is going to offer the world, that the world is going to see as so valuable that it's going to do business with us? We have to ask that question in North Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, South Africa. And if we're willing to make the investments in human capital, technology, infrastructure to build those capabilities, I hold the view, and I am an optimist, that Africa is one of the most exciting places in the world to be. It is about building that capability.
Thank you, Marius. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Ambassador Park. I think this is a conversation that we, the four of us, could possibly have for hours on end. But it's not just about the four of us, is it? It's also about the people who are interested in this topic, the people who are tuned in online, following the discussion, but also the people who made their way here for the discussion that we will now have about some of the issues that you've raised. I suppose in closing, I can't thank you enough because you've already done quite a lot. But I suppose in closing, it's worth reflecting on some of the key points that have come out from all you've said. You, Marius, someone who self professes to be, an optimist. Martin, who says, I'm not a pessimist, I'm pragmatic, who I'm going to call a cynic for the purposes of this. Ambassador Park, someone who has learned a lot of lessons from the work that you do, but isn't precious about keeping it to himself and making sure that that intellectual property that Martin speaks about is something that you share with a wider audience. Even the cynics, not one cynic, but even the cynics agree that whether it's the fourth industrial revolution, whether it's having all the revolutions work at the very same time, that you need people to do that. That at the end of the day, even the machines themselves, attempts to sabotage them, attempts to make sure that they don't overtake us, even that is done by people. And yes, money matters for those people. And yes, productivity matters, capability, connectivity, infrastructure matters for those people. And yes, sometimes they can get a bit precious about their territories and they can say, now we've done a great job, we don't want any more of you here. But also recognizing that without that intellectual capacity that the three of you have, I have very little of it, but the three of you have, that we need that. We need people to be going out into the 56 now African states to be able to impart that kind of knowledge, such that people that are receiving medication through drones in Kigali know where this comes from, who thought this, who decided if a car can't get there, a drone certainly can, right? And making sure that Africa progresses at the same level. I'm going to end with half of what a cynic said. I'm not going to name him. I'm going to end with this. And I'm going to say, never miss an opportunity, full stop. The rest of that, I'm not going to say it. Never miss an opportunity. Whether it's the fourth industrial revolution, whether it's the effort towards inclusive growth on the African continent and our individual states, it is about seizing those opportunities. So again, to the three of you, thank you very much. To the people who joined us online, thank you so much for sparing your time this morning. We will have to say goodbye to you because after this, we will have a closed discussion under the Chatham House rule where we really unpack some of the issues. I suspect from our audience that there will be quite a lot that needs to be discussed about what the fourth industrial revolutions means, not just for South Africa, but for the rest of the African continent, but importantly, what the fourth industrial revolution means for the rest of the world. So, online audience, thank you very much for your attention. We bid you farewell.